Welcome back to the Health Physics Society's video series pursuing the truth and promoting transparency regarding the historical foundations of the current radiation protection philosophy based on a linear no-threshold theory for cancer risk assessment. I'm Dr. John Cardarelli, President of the Health Physics Society. In the 16th episode, we learned how Edward Lewis's 1957 paper in Science became one of the most influential papers in cancer risk assessment affecting U.S. policy. In this episode, Dr. Calabrese digs deeper into the Lewis's paper and uncovers details that should have been addressed, which would have doomed the adoption of the linear no-threshold model for cancer risk assessment. What did he find? It may cause you to ask, how could this happen? Let's watch.
So there was the ankylosing spondylitis study, the radiologists, the thymus study, and then the fourth study that was used was the leukemia study.
That's correct.
And were there problems with that study?
Well, this is a very significant point, and that is that after all was said and done, the key focus of the Lewis paper was going to really be on the atomic bomb victims and the leukemias that were reported. Now, I got interested in this, didn't anticipate getting involved in it, but there was a paper that was published by two individuals a few years ago, and it was claiming that in fact that at low doses, the people who lived kind of furthest away were furthest away from where the hypocenter of the atomic bomb dropped, where it really dropped. That there was actually a decrease in the occurrence of leukemias compared to a control population, and so I read the paper and I thought that maybe the person was crazy, to be honest with you. He just was seeing something that wasn't there, and it passed through a peer review, and so I wondered whether in fact it was real or not, and I had studied the Lewis paper quite a bit, and it was really the same time framework, the same data, and Lewis had showed that there was a linear dose response. And so this other person, somewhat contemporary, going back and looking at the historical data, and shows like a little dip, there's a decrease in risk. And so I go and it's now been maybe 3 years since it was originally published. And so I go and I said, well, if this is true, that's a big finding. Finding that, wow, I mean, maybe it's been wrong at the low dose level. And so I look and I find that essentially nobody cited that person's paper. And I said, this is very weird to me, that something that could be so significant, nobody, even the advocates of challenging LNT, they don't even pick up on this. And so I went and read it pretty carefully, and so I couldn't resolve the difference. And so I have a colleague where I work, and I said, would you mind looking at the Lewis paper and this other one and trying to resolve these things for me, over the next 3 or 4 days? And so the person actually didn't do anything. And so I said, well, if he's not going to do it, then I'm going to step in there and try to do this thing. So I then got involved with a deep dive into this question. And what I found was extremely intriguing. I was going to find who's telling the truth here, Lewis or this other paper. And so what happened was that there was the original report of what I'm going to call a J-shaped dose response, where the risk was less than the control group, was reported in 1958. And it was reported by one of the investigators of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. And the report was published in the journal Science. And it was never really picked up on. It was written very soberly, you might say. And the data were there. And then the person's findings were then published in a United Nations report on nuclear health effects. And nobody really picked up on this. And so then in 2010, in a paper, a Polish scientist went back and refloated this 1958 paper. And I knew that Polish scientist. He's passed away now, but he had a lot of credibility. And he was somewhat endorsing of this view. So I went back and I said, well, I'll do some deeper dive into this thing. So I got every paper that was published related to leukemia and the atomic bomb. And what I found was actually pretty striking. And that was that these J shapes had been reported by multiple investigators, and they were reported each kind of, the data set it was the same data set, but it kept changing because as they studied it from, let's say, 1950 to 1960, well, they're finding more cases of leukemia. And so if you looked at it in 1953, there might have been 55 cases, but in 1954 there were 70 cases, and in 1956 there were 150 cases. So they keep changing the number of cases, and people are looking at this almost iteratively. And so if you look up at the screen, you find that there are many different studies of this population, and it keeps expanding just because, as what I just said, they keep adding more cases.
And these are the J-shaped curves.
Yes, and this little dashed line over here, this is what the control group value would be. So everything is compared to the control group, relative to the control group. And what you see, when you're closest to where the bomb dropped, things are really bad. The scores are going, very, very high for leukemia. But as you go away from the hypocenter of the bomb, you notice a really consistent and very unexpected finding, and that is that the occurrence of leukemias are consistently less than the control group. And this is
so they're getting less cancer.
Less leukemia. And this is true whether you are in Nagasaki or Hiroshima. It happens in both places. It's kind of like a confirmation study. And this really struck me amazingly. And I was wondering, well, how did Lewis ever get a linear dose response? And I would point out that this this J-shaped response, you can notice up here I have a 1956 NAS, okay? Yes. Now, I've been very critical of the Bayer Committee, the Bayer Genetics Committee of 1956. This is one of the other panels. This is the medical panel. And the medical panel had a separate report, very long report, and they looked at medical issues, all sorts of medical issues, and they actually looked at the cancer issue, something that the genetics panel wouldn't do. And so I looked at them in considerable detail, and they themselves show a J-shaped dose response like the others. But when you go into the discussion and the debate, they talk about this, and they talk about this being a problem because it conflicts with the linear perspective that's emerging. That who could even imagine that you could have lower doses of radiation could reduce the risk of leukemia, and so it's all built into this, and I hadn't discovered this until probably the last 18 months or so. It's
curious they found it a problem. There are other substances that have similar effects on the human body. Is that not correct?
That's very true, but this was within a heightened focus on this very politicized sort of an issue. And so what happened is that I looked at all these because I was wondering, I was trying to figure out how did Lewis do it? How did Lewis get all these results that I'm coming up with are J-shaped, but Lewis publishes this in Science, and his is linear,
a straight line.
And I'd have to say that Lewis is using the exact same data that I have up on the board, the exact same data. So now I can tell you how Lewis comes up with his linear dose response. What Lewis does is he combines these doses here that are below with a group up above. And so he consolidates that, and that becomes his low-dose group. And so then when you then, you might say, show the dose-response relationship, it appears to be linear to the origin. And so by combining the low-dose group with the group next above it, you mask the protective effect. And I have seen that done in many other circumstances. And that, as it turns out, the dose response effect becomes it becomes distorted, and it becomes an improper representation of the data, and you miss the biology of low doses. And so, in this particular case, what you have is Lewis either by self-deception, lack of experience. But Lewis wasn't alone in this. You saw these J-shaped dose responses. They are data that, for the most part, everybody ignored. But I went back into their studies and found them and was able to just plot their data, and their data showed J-shaped dose responses. And so this now I knew that this original paper was criticized because they found this J-shaped response with just looking at that one 1958 study, and Mayan just expanded it to about 12 or so other studies. But they were criticized in the peer review process because they didn't bring it out to, well, what happened in the 1960s and 1970s? Can you look out to a 30 or 40 year latency period? And so what I did was I decided to go and I'll do what the reviewers said. So I then went and followed. And these are reports that came out of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission and the subsequent organization, with a name change, replaced them. And when I looked at those data, I found the same J-shaped dose responses. That this J-shaped dose response for leukemia was present all that time, and that when you look at different techniques that the epidemiologists often use. Now, many times what they do is that they do that sleight of hand combining low to high. I even saw, it was very bizarre, in one of the studies that was done by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission epidemiologist. They had the Hiroshima data and the Nagasaki data. And in one case, they combined the two and got a linear. And the other case, they didn't. And you could see a J-shaped dose response. And they gave no reason why or wherefore what they did. But in this particular case, what I found is that the entire foundation of what Lewis came up with was actually false. That he came up with a mistake. He made a mistake. The mistake shows a linear dose response, that the data leading up to his work, prior to his work that he used, because there was published data that was before his work. If you evaluate it the way I have, it showed a J-shaped response. The unpublished extra samples that he got because of the intervention of Beetle all supported the J-shaped dose response. And then the material that was done after Lewis was done publishing his paper also supported the J-shaped dose response. And Lewis goes on and he talks about it being linear down to a single dose. And the field today has believed this. And this work refutes that.
Are there still studies being done today? And are they still using the technique of combining the low dose and the high dose?
I've seen that in all kinds of studies. There was a major fluoroscopy study for breast cancer, and it was linear down to a single dose, you might say. That's how they. But if you looked into the patients and how much they have, and you plotted it so that you could span out those doses, you saw a J-shaped dose response. You saw a protective effect at lower doses. So it was really challenging of the perspective. And what I found was that I found that there was such a great reliance upon an impact of the Lewis paper on the regulatory community and the beliefs that we have today. And yet when you go back and you look at Ed Lewis. Now, Ed Lewis, I'd have to say that he was a young professor at that time. And he went on to win a Nobel Prize himself.
There are a lot of Nobel Prize winners in this story.
Yeah, there are. And Ed Lewis gets a Nobel Prize. He became famous after this. He became famous twice in his life, really. He wins a Nobel Prize towards the end of his life, and he gets it in 1995. Now, you could go back 40 years, and Ed Lewis is finding himself in this crazy mystery and controversy of low-dose radiation, which is not going to be what he gets his Nobel Prize on. And so like Muller and like George Beadle, 3 Nobel Prize winners all connected to each other here. But going back over here, Ed Lewis was people have looked at him, retrospectively after he passed away in a sympathetic manner. From everything I read, he was a wonderful man and beloved by all who knew him. And he was not a political activist. He just kind of, did his thing with his science and things of that nature. And that's how he's portrayed. And so then I come in and I look at it, and I see a different person. I see really a different Ed Lewis. I see an Ed Lewis who is unbelievably biased, a person who was not fair with the facts, who is inexperienced within this context of human risk assessment, didn't know what he was getting into, but knew the answer before he started. In his evaluations, I can tell you that I knew he was aware of animal studies. There was a number of animal studies that were done when atomic bombs were dropped above the ground, and U.S. investigators put mice and rats out in the field at different distances away so they could do studies on the effects of atomic bombs on mice and rats, where they would use thousands and thousands and thousands of rats, large studies. And these were published in the 1950s, 53, 54, 55.
Did they show a similar response?
Well, they showed leukemias and things of that nature, just like you might expect them to show it. But I would have to tell you that they showed thresholds. And they showed them at particularly high levels. In some of the studies, even in the several hundred rats, and there was one over 400 rats, close to even a lethal dose for a human. But there were multiple thresholds. There were even some indications of these J-shaped dose responses. And Lewis cited these in his draft that he sent to the National Academy in November of 1956. But when he published his paper in Science in May of 1957, that reference was taken out. Why he took it out, I don't know. It would not have supported his linearity case, I can assure you of that. And so when I looked at Lewis, I'm saying, well, gee, I said, here's a guy who got it wrong on the dose response on the most fundamental issue that he was dealing with, which was the Japanese leukemia people. And then when it came to the other 3 cases, he basically was dishonest with the readership. And then, when an epidemiologist is doing something, they, and beyond that, he then ignores the Neal study that gives him the mechanism for mutation in cancer because it didn't support it, and he then goes back into the Drosophila studies to do that, and without even discussing or debating that issue, it doesn't set right with anybody who's trying to be fair in looking at this. And at the same time, what happens is that in epidemiology, there's always alternative causations. What could be causing leukemia? Well, he never brings up that the Japanese population back in 1950 or so, based on surveys, was consuming about 1,500 cigarettes per day. And they didn't break it down males versus females, but it's about 1,500 per day. Well, cigarette smoking is a leukemogen, but he doesn't bring that up. He also doesn't bring up that less than 20% of the Japanese population had refrigeration back in 1954. And so now it's hard for us to believe that. In 1954, in my little town where I grew up, we had a refrigerator. Okay, that sort of thing. But 80% of the Japanese, more than 80% of the Japanese population at that same time didn't have one, didn't have a quote-unquote ice box or a refrigerator, that sort of thing. And so what that meant was they had to preserve their meats and their fish. And you do that with compounds that have the capacity to cause nitrosamines and other things, and then they have increased risks of leukemia. Did he bring that up? No, he didn't bring up alternative causation issues or things of that nature. In addition to that, back in the 1920s to the present time, but especially up into his time, it was very well known that if you had a prior respiratory viral infection, it was highly associated with a risk of leukemia. And it wasn't mean that if you had one that your risk would be high, but it meant that about 50% of the leukemia cases in children were associated with very extreme respiratory viral infections before they came down with the leukemia. It was extremely high. And one of the members on the Bayer pathology medical panel was one of the leading publishers on that, and indicated that was one of his criticisms of the study that Lewis had, was that he should have mentioned that there was alternative causation, and Lewis would either ignored it, didn't know what to do, didn't have other people on. He's working by himself for the most part, and so what happens is that this paper that has so many flaws to it, so much bias involved in it, gets published in Science.
Thank you for watching the 17th episode on the historical foundations of the linear no threshold theory, where we learned Edward Lewis's influential 1957 Science paper relied on 4 studies that not only cautioned against their use for low-dose risk assessment, but actually showed a threshold, or a J-shaped dose response. The National Academy of Sciences medical panel even discusses this observation and characterized it as something fishy and disturbing. Nonetheless, Lewis concludes these studies support a linear no-threshold dose response for leukemia. Scientific integrity concerns begin to rise when Dr. Calabrese discovers that data of the atomic bomb survivors were manipulated in a manner that masked a J-shaped response, an effect that has been observed in follow-up studies through the 1970s. Many confounders are not discussed in his Science paper, and a reference was removed from an earlier draft of the paper that clearly showed a threshold response for leukemia. Was that an early form of scientific censorship? In the next episode, we'll take a closer look at how this paper ultimately serves to create the precautionary principle, despite an incredible discovery. The HPS is a trusted source of radiation information. We're a scientific organization, and as is offered with the scientific peer review process, viewers are encouraged to send comments or suggested corrections to factcheck@hps.org, and be sure to include your sources, so that we may correct the record if necessary. If any changes are made, they will appear at the end of this episode. Please visit our Ask the Experts website to ask questions or seek answers to common radiation-related questions, and view our fact sheets. We also have official position statements that can be found at hps.org. Finally, if you wish to join the Home for Radiation Protection Professionals, please visit the link below. We welcome you.